When a father's hatred runs so deep he sells his own daughter like cattle, you'd think her story ends there. But sometimes the cruelest betrayal becomes the doorway to destiny. Today I'm sharing the incredible tale of Karen May, a woman who went from being auctioned off as worthless to becoming the most powerful woman in an entire valley. Her transformation will shock you, and her final confrontation with her father will leave you speechless. Stay with me until the very end, and please comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this amazing story travels. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty trading post as Abel May dragged his daughter through the crowd like a reluctant mule. Karen stumbled behind him, her worn dress catching on splinters from the wooden platform where livestock were usually sold. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Today, human flesh would be bartered alongside cattle and horses. "Step right up, gentlemen." Abel's voice boomed across the gathering, his weathered face twisted with disgust as he glanced back at Karen. "Got myself a burden I need to shed. She eats more than she's worth, can't find her a husband, and Lord knows I've tried everything short of paying men to take her." The crowd erupted in cruel laughter. Karen kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her cheeks burning with shame as her father's words cut deeper than any physical blow ever could. At 23, she carried extra weight that her father saw as a personal insult, though anyone with eyes could see the gentle beauty that lived beneath his relentless criticism. "She's strong as an ox. I'll give her that." Abel continued circling her like a rancher showing off livestock. "Can cook, clean, mend, and work a garden. Just don't expect much to look at. But hell, some of you mountain men ain't exactly prizes yourselves." More laughter rippled through the crowd. Karen's hands trembled as she clutched the small bundle containing her only possessions: her mother's Bible, a quilt sewn with loving hands, and the faded photograph of a woman whose smile had once been Karen's whole world. "What's your asking price, Abel?" called out a grizzled prospector missing half his teeth. "I could use someone to cook and keep my cabin warm up in the high country." $50 and she's yours," Abel replied without hesitation, not even glancing at his daughter's face. "That's less than I'd ask for a decent mule, but I'm feeling generous today." The prospector spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "30, take it or leave it." "Now hold on," interrupted another voice. "Let me get a closer look at what we're buying here." A heavy-set man with cruel eyes pushed forward, his gaze traveling over Karen in a way that made her skin crawl. "Does she come with any guarantees? What if she runs off?" Abel's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Where's she gonna run to look at her? Ain't exactly built for speed. Besides, nobody wants damaged goods. Tried to marry her off for 3 years, even offered dowries, no takers." "Damaged how?" the man pressed, stepping closer to Karen. "Weak in the head," Abel said dismissively. "Always reading that Bible, singing hymns, talking about God's love and forgiveness. What man wants a wife who thinks she's too good for honest work because she's got Jesus on her side?" Karen finally lifted her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's not true, Papa. I've worked every day since Mama died. I've never complained, never disobeyed, never—" "Shut your mouth." Abel's hand connected with her cheek in a sharp crack that echoed across the trading post. "Nobody asked you to speak. You're merchandise now, so act like it." The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the spectacle. Among them stood respectable ranchers' wives who watched with disapproval, young men who jeered and pointed, and older settlers who shook their heads but said nothing. Karen searched their faces desperately, looking for one person who might see her as human rather than property. $40, called out the heavy-set man. "Final offer." "Sold to," Abel began, but his words were cut short by the sound of heavy boots on wooden planks. The crowd parted as a figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the trading post. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face marked by a jagged scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. His clothes were clean but simple: wool pants, a flannel shirt, and boots that had seen honest work. Most notably, he moved with quiet confidence, as if he owned every inch of ground he walked on. Michael Boon had been watching from the edge of the crowd for the past 10 minutes, his jaw tightening with each cruel word that fell from Abel May's lips. He'd come to the trading post for supplies, not to witness a father destroy his own daughter's dignity for the entertainment of strangers. "I'll give you 60, Michael said simply, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet crowd. Abel's eyes lit up with greed. $60? Well, now that's more like it. You got yourself a deal, stranger." "I wasn't finished," Michael continued, stepping closer to the platform. His gaze found Karen's, and for a moment she saw something she hadn't expected: kindness. $60 for her freedom, not her servitude. She comes with me as an equal, not as property. The crowd murmured in confusion. Abel's face reddened with anger. "Now see here, that ain't how this works. You're buying her same as buying a horse or a cow. What you do with her after is your business, but the transaction is clear." Michael reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch heavy with coins. "The transaction is exactly what I say it is. $60 for her freedom from you, Abel May. After that, the lady makes her own choices." "Lady," Abel spat, "you're either blind or stupid, mountain man. This here's a burden I'm trying to shed, not some fine lady looking for a husband." "Then you're a fool," Michael replied calmly, counting out silver dollars onto the platform, "because any man with eyes can see she's worth more than this entire crowd put together." Karen stared at this stranger in amazement. No one had ever spoken about her that way, certainly not where others could hear. She didn't know if he was sincere or simply playing some elaborate game, but his words wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket on a cold night. "You're serious about this?" Abel asked, his greed warring with his confusion. $60. Dead serious." Michael placed the final coin on the platform. "Count them if you want. That's your money, and this is my offer to the lady." He turned to Karen directly. "Miss, I live alone in a cabin up in Bear Creek Valley. It's clean, warm, and peaceful. I could use someone to help with cooking and household tasks, but I'm offering you honest work for honest wages plus room and board. You'd have your own space, your own choices, and my word that you'd be treated with respect." The crowd had fallen completely silent. Even the children had stopped their playing to listen. Karen felt every eye upon her as she tried to process what was happening. Her father's face was purple with rage, while this stranger, this Michael Boon, waited patiently for her answer. She began, then stopped. Her whole life decisions had been made for her: where to live, what to do, how to behave, what to think. The idea that someone was actually asking for her choice was almost incomprehensible. "Think about it," Michael said gently. "Take your time, but know this: if you say yes, you leave here with dignity intact. If you say no, you're free to choose your own path. Either way, you're not property to be sold." Abel snatched up the coins with trembling hands. "She's yours, mountain man. Don't come crying to me when you realize what a mistake you've made." "The only mistake here," Michael said quietly, his eyes never leaving Abel's face, "is how a man can look at his own daughter and see nothing but a burden to shed." The words hit Abel like a physical blow, but before he could respond, Michael had stepped onto the platform and extended his hand to Karen. "Ma'am, what do you say?" Karen looked at his outstretched hand, then at her father's face, then at the crowd of people who had watched her humiliation without a word of protest. Finally, she looked back at Michael Boon, this scarred stranger who had called her a lady and offered her something she'd never had before: choice. "Yes," she whispered, then cleared her throat and spoke louder. "Yes, I'll come with you." Michael smiled, and the transformation of his scarred face was remarkable. "Then let's gather your things and head home." "This is all I have," Karen said, lifting her small bundle. "Then that's all you need," Michael replied. He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never learned to back down. Anyone who's got something to say about this arrangement can say it to my face right now or hold their peace forever. Silence greeted his challenge. Even the heavy-set man who had been bidding on Karen stepped back, unwilling to meet Michael's steady gaze. "Good," Michael said. He jumped down from the platform and extended his hand to help Karen down. "Come on, miss, let's get you out of here." As they walked through the crowd together, Karen heard whispers following in their wake. Some wondered if Michael was simple-minded, others speculated about his motives, and a few expressed genuine confusion about why any man would pay good money for damaged goods. But Karen found herself caring less about their words with each step she took away from that platform. Michael led her to a sturdy wagon hitched to two well-fed horses. In the back, she could see supplies for the journey: sacks of flour and beans, a barrel of salt pork tools, and other necessities. Everything spoke of a man who planned ahead and took care of what was his. "Can you drive a wagon?" Michael asked as he helped her up onto the seat. "Yes, sir. Papa taught me when I was 12. "Good. We'll take turns on the way up to the valley. It's a long ride and the horses will need rest." He settled beside her and took up the reins. "And you can call me Michael. Sir is for bosses and strangers. I'm neither." As they pulled away from the trading post, Karen risked a glance back. Her father was already walking toward the saloon, her sale forgotten now that he had his money. The crowd was dispersing, moving on to other entertainment. In a matter of minutes, her entire life had changed direction, and the world was already forgetting she had ever been there. "Any regrets?" Michael asked quietly, following her gaze. Karen thought about the question seriously. Behind her lay everything she had ever known: a father who saw her as a burden, a town that had watched her humiliation with entertainment, a life of endless criticism and conditional love. Ahead lay uncertainty but also possibility. "No," she said finally. "No regrets." Michael nodded approvingly. "Good, because the valley is about to gain something special even if it doesn't know it yet." The wagon rolled on through the afternoon, carrying them away from the trading post and toward the mountains. Karen watched the landscape change from dusty plains to rolling hills, then to the first gentle slopes that promised higher country ahead. With each mile, she felt something inside her chest loosening, a knot of tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. "Tell me about the valley," she said, after they'd been riding in comfortable silence for an hour. Michael's face softened as he spoke. "It's God's country up there. Clear streams, good soil, and mountains that touch the sky. Peaceful mostly. Got a few neighbors scattered around, but plenty of space for privacy. Weather can be harsh in winter, but the cabin's built solid. You'll be warm and safe." "How long have you lived there?" "About 5 years now. Came up after—" He touched the scar on his face unconsciously. "After I needed a place to heal up and think about things. Never planned to stay, but the land kind of grows on you." Karen wanted to ask about the scar, about what had driven him to seek solitude in the mountains, but something in his expression warned her that those stories would come in their own time, if at all. "What about supplies? Food, medicine, things like that?" "There's a general store about 20 miles south, and Doc Henderson makes rounds through the valley every few months. Mostly, though, we take care of ourselves. Hunting, fishing, gardens, preserving food for winter. It's a simple life, but it's honest." The word honest resonated with Karen. She had grown up in a world of pretense and performance where her value was constantly measured against impossible standards. The idea of a simple, honest life appealed to her more than Michael could possibly know. As evening approached, Michael guided the wagon off the main trail and into a small clearing beside a creek. "We'll camp here tonight," he said. "Valley's still another day's ride, and the horses need rest." Karen climbed down from the wagon, her body stiff from the long day of travel. She had expected to feel afraid, alone in the wilderness with a virtual stranger, but instead she felt oddly at peace. Michael moved around their temporary camp with efficient purpose, unhitching the horses, gathering firewood, and setting up a simple shelter from supplies in the wagon. "Can I help?" Karen asked, standing uncertainly beside their growing fire. "Can you cook?" Michael asked. "I've got bacon, beans, and coffee, but I'm not much of a hand in the kitchen." Karen smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt in months. "I can cook." As she prepared their simple meal over the open fire, Michael tended to the horses and secured their camp for the night. Karen found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking. There was something about his movements, his quiet competence, that spoke of a man comfortable with solitude but not bitter about it. He wasn't the rough, crude mountain man she had expected, but rather someone who seemed to have chosen simplicity over society. "This is good," Michael said, as they shared their meal by the firelight. "Been living on my own, cooking for too long." "It's just bacon and beans," Karen replied modestly. "Sometimes the simple things are the best things," Michael said. "You'll find that's true about a lot of life up in the valley." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the creek babble and watching sparks rise toward the star-filled sky. Finally, Karen gathered the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her all day. "Why did you do it? Why did you pay for my freedom when you could have just let things happen?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "My mother used to say that God puts us in certain places at certain times for a reason. Maybe I was supposed to be at that trading post today. Maybe you were supposed to need someone to see your worth when nobody else would." "You don't even know me," Karen protested. "What if I'm everything my father said I was? What if I'm weak or lazy or—" "Then I'll have been wrong," Michael interrupted gently. "But I don't think I am. I've gotten pretty good at reading people over the years. And what I saw today was a woman with strength she doesn't even know she has yet." Karen felt tears prick at her eyes. "Nobody's ever said anything like that about me before." "Then nobody's been paying attention," Michael said simply. "Your father's a fool, and those people at the trading post are sheep. But you've got something they're all missing." "What's that?" Michael looked at her directly, his expression serious. "Dignity. Real dignity, not the kind you put on like fancy clothes. The kind that comes from knowing your own worth, even when nobody else does." That night, as Karen lay wrapped in her mother's quilt under the vast canopy of stars, she thought about dignity and worth and the strange turns that life could take. Tomorrow she would see her new home. Tomorrow her real life might finally begin. But tonight, for the first time in years, she fell asleep without the weight of her father's disappointment crushing down on her chest. Tonight, she was free. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows across their camp. In the distance, an owl called out across the darkness, and Karen smiled as she drifted off to sleep. She was no longer merchandise to be sold or a burden to be shed. She was a woman with choices riding toward a new life, with a man who had seen her worth when no one else would. And for the first time in her 23 years, that felt like more than enough. The morning sun filtered through the pine trees as Michael guided the wagon up the winding mountain trail, each turn revealing more of the breathtaking valley that would become Karen's new home. The air grew thinner and cleaner, with every mile carrying the scent of wildflowers and the promise of snow-capped peaks ahead. "There," Michael said, pointing through a gap in the trees. "Bear Creek Valley." Karen's breath caught in her throat. The valley spread before them like something from a dream. Emerald meadows dotted with wildflowers, a crystal-clear stream winding through the center, and mountains rising on all sides like protective walls. A few cabins were scattered across the landscape, their smoke rising straight up in the still morning air. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and meant it. Michael's cabin sat on a gentle rise overlooking the stream, built from solid logs and chinked with care. A small garden plot showed neat rows of vegetables, and a barn stood nearby with a corral for the horses. Everything spoke of a man who took pride in his work and his home. As they pulled up to the cabin, a neighbor emerged from the tree line, a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and work-worn hands. "Michael," the man called out, raising a hand in greeting. Didn't expect you back so soon from the trading post. Ben Morrison, meet Miss Karen May, Michael said as he helped Karen down from the wagon. Karen Ben's got the spread about 2 miles downstream, good neighbor and a better friend. Ben's eyes widened slightly as he took in the situation, but his smile remained genuine. Ma'am, pleasure to meet you. Welcome to the valley. Thank you, Karen replied, grateful for the warmth in his voice. It's lovely here. That it is, Ben agreed. We've got ourselves a little piece of heaven up here, though it takes some getting used to if you're from town. He paused, studying her face with the practiced eye of someone who had seen his share of troubles. You planning on staying long? As long as she wants, Michael answered before Karen could speak. Miss Karen's going to help with the household, and I suspect she'll find plenty to keep her busy. Ben nodded slowly, understanding, passing between the two men. Well, if you need anything at all, you just holler. My Mary's been saying we need more women folk in the valley. Gets lonely for the wives up here sometimes. After Ben left, Michael showed Karen around the cabin. It was larger than it had appeared from outside, with 2 main rooms downstairs, a kitchen and living area combined, and a separate room that served as Michael's study and storage. A narrow staircase led to a loft area under the eaves. You can have the loft, Michael said. It's private and there's a good window for light. I'll sleep down here by the fire. The loft was cozy and clean, with a real bed covered by a colorful quilt and a small dresser for her belongings. A window looked out over the valley, framing the view like a painting. Karen set her mother's quilt on the bed and unpacked her few possessions, feeling for the first time like she had a space that belonged to her. When she came back downstairs, Michael had coffee brewing and was slicing bread from a loaf that had seen better days. I should warn you, he said with a rueful smile. My cooking skills pretty much end at coffee and burnt meat. Been living on beans and hardtack for longer than I care to admit. Well, that explains why you were willing to pay $60 for a cook, Karen said, surprising herself with the teasing note in her voice. Michael laughed, a rich, genuine sound that seemed to fill the cabin with warmth. Caught me, though I'd have paid twice that just to get you away from that crowd. Over the next few days, Karen threw herself into making the cabin a proper home. She scrubbed every surface until it gleamed, organized the pantry with military precision, and planted herbs in the small patch of soil beside the kitchen door. Michael watched her transformation with quiet amazement, but it was when she began to sing while she worked that he truly understood what had come into his life. Karen's voice was clear and sweet, carrying hymns learned at her mother's knee and folk songs that seemed to make the very walls of the cabin come alive. She sang while she kneaded bread, hummed while she tended the garden, and filled the mountain silence with melodies that spoke of hope and joy. Where did you learn to sing like that? Michael asked one evening as they sat on the porch after supper. From my mama, Karen replied, her fingers absently stroking the edge of her mother's quilt. She said music was God's gift to help us through the hard times. When she was dying, she made me promise to keep singing no matter what. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Papa wasn't always. Karen paused, searching for the right words. He wasn't always the way he is now. When Mama was alive, he could be kind, but after she died, it was like something broke inside him. I reminded him too much of her, I think, and that made him angry. Michael reached over and gently squeezed her hand. His anger was never about you, Karen. Some people, when they lose what they love most, they can't find their way back to loving anything else. Is that what happened to you? Karen asked softly, glancing at the scar on his face. Michael was quiet for a long moment, his fingers unconsciously tracing the mark. Different story, he said finally, but yes, I suppose loss played a part. It was 3 weeks into her stay when Karen made the discovery that would change everything. She had been cleaning out an old trunk in the loft, looking for extra blankets, before the weather turned cold, when her fingers found something unusual sewn into the lining of her mother's quilt. Michael, she called down, her voice trembling with excitement. Can you come up here? I need you to see something. Michael climbed the narrow stairs to find Karen sitting on the bed, the quilt spread before her. In her hands was a folded piece of parchment yellowed with age but still intact. It was sewn into the quilt, she explained, her hands shaking as she unfolded the document. I was checking for tears, and I felt something stiff in the lining. Michael sat beside her as they read the document together. It was a legal deed signed and witnessed granting water rights to the entire Bear Creek and its tributaries to one Mary Catherine Sullivan, Karen's mother's maiden name. My God, Michael breathed. Do you know what this means? Karen stared at the paper, trying to process the implications. The whole creek, all of it. Every drop from the source to where it joins the river 20 miles downstream. This deed predates every other claim in the valley by 15 years. Michael's voice was filled with awe. Karen, this makes you the legal owner of the most valuable resource in 3 counties. But how Mama never said anything about this? Look at the date. Michael pointed to the faded ink. This was signed 2 years before you were born. Your mother must have filed this claim when she first came west, probably with her first husband. She was married before Papa. Must have been. The deed's in her maiden name, but there's a witness signature here, John Sullivan, probably her first husband. He must have died, and she remarried your father but never told him about the water rights. Karen sank back against the pillows, overwhelmed. Why would she hide this? Smart woman, Michael said grimly. Your father would have sold these rights the day after she died. She was protecting your future. But even as they marveled at the discovery, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line below. Ben Morrison had come to borrow some tools and had heard Karen's excited call through the open window. What he overheard would soon spread through the valley like wildfire. The next morning brought their first visitor since Karen's arrival. Mary Morrison, Ben's wife, carrying a basket of fresh eggs and wearing her Sunday dress, despite it being a Wednesday. I just had to come welcome you properly, Mary said, though her eyes kept darting around the cabin as if looking for something. Ben told me we had a new neighbor. That's very kind of you, Karen replied, inviting her in for coffee. Mary was a pleasant woman in her 40s with graying hair and a motherly manner, but Karen sensed an underlying tension in her visit. Must be quite an adjustment coming from town life to the mountains. Mary continued, settling herself at the kitchen table. Of course, I'm sure you'll find plenty to keep you busy. Folks say the valley's going to see some changes soon. Changes? Karen asked, setting down cups of coffee. Oh, you haven't heard railroad's been sniffing around talking about running a line through to the mining camps up north. Would need water rights, of course, for the steam engines. Folks with water claims stand to make a fortune. Karen's hand stilled on the coffee pot. Is that so? Oh yes, Ben heard they're offering top dollar for any legitimate water claims. Of course, most of the rights around here are pretty recent, filed by homesteaders. Nothing too valuable. Mary's eyes fixed on Karen with sudden intensity. You wouldn't happen to know anything about old claims, would you? From before the Homestead Acts? I'm afraid I wouldn't know about such things, Karen replied carefully, but she could see Michael tense in the doorway. After Mary left, Michael paced the cabin like a caged animal. She knows, he said grimly. Ben must have overheard us yesterday. By now, half the valley knows you've got something valuable hidden away. What do? We go to town and get that deed properly recorded before someone tries to challenge it, and we do it today. But as they prepared for the trip to the county seat, neither of them saw the rider galloping hard toward the valley's southern entrance, carrying news that would reach Abel May before sunset. The journey to Millbrook took them down the winding mountain trail and through 2 other valleys, each mile taking them further from the peaceful isolation of Bear Creek. Karen found herself growing nervous as they approached civilization, but Michael's steady presence beside her provided comfort. You sure about this? He asked as they pulled up in front of the courthouse. Once this deed is recorded, there's no going back. Everyone will know you own the water rights. Mama kept this secret for 23 years, Karen replied, touching the deed safely tucked in her coat pocket. She must have had a reason for hiding it, but she also must have had a reason for keeping it. I think she wanted me to have choices she never had. The county clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, examined the deed with painstaking care. "This is quite old," he muttered, holding it up to the light. "But the signatures appear genuine and the witness marks are properly notarized. The chain of title seems clear. Mary Catherine Sullivan to her heirs. You say you're her daughter." "I am. I have her marriage certificate to my father and my birth certificate showing her as my mother." "And your father, where is he in all this?" Michael stepped forward. "Her father sold his interest in his daughter's future for $60 at a trading post 3 weeks ago. Any claims he might have had, he forfeited." The clerk's eyebrows rose. "Sold his interest. That's highly irregular." "So was the transaction," Michael replied coldly, "but it was legal, witnessed, and final." 2 hours later, they emerged from the courthouse with the deed properly recorded in Karen's name. She was now officially and legally the owner of water rights worth more than most people in the territory would see in a lifetime. "How do you feel?" Michael asked as they climbed back onto the wagon. "Scared," Karen admitted, "and responsible, and like my whole life just changed again." "It has, but you're not facing it alone." On the ride back to the valley, they talked about what the deed meant, not just financially, but practically. Karen would need to decide how to manage the water rights, whether to sell them to the railroad or lease them to the valley's farmers and ranchers. It was a decision that would affect not just her future, but the future of everyone in Bear Creek Valley. "I don't want to hurt the people who've been good to us," Karen said as they climbed back into the mountains. "Ben and Mary, the other neighbors, they've built their lives here. Good water management helps everyone," Michael assured her. "It's the speculators and railroad men you'll need to watch out for. They'll try to pressure you into selling cheap or find ways to challenge your claim." As if summoned by his words, they saw dust rising in the distance, a group of riders heading up the valley trail at a hard gallop. Michael pulled the wagon off the main trail and into the shelter of some trees. 5 men, he counted, watching through the branches. Riding like they've got business somewhere. Karen's blood ran cold as she recognized the lead rider. "That's Papa," she whispered. "That's my father." Michael's face hardened as he watched Abel May and his companions disappear around a bend in the trail. He knows about the deed. Question is, how much does he know and what does he think he can do about it? They waited until the riders were well ahead before continuing their journey home. But as they crested the final hill before their valley, they could see smoke rising from multiple locations. Not the usual thin streams from cabin chimneys, but thick, dark plumes that spoke of trouble. "The Morrison place," Michael said grimly, pointing to the largest column of smoke. "And that looks like the Henderson cabin burning too." Karen felt sick to her stomach. "They're burning people out." "Looks like it. Your father's not just here to talk." They approached their own cabin carefully, but it appeared untouched. However, as they pulled into the yard, Ben Morrison emerged from the barn, his face grim and his shirt torn. "Thank God you're back," he said, helping Karen down from the wagon. "Abel May and his boys have been tearing through the valley all afternoon. They burned out 3 families and beat Tom Henderson near to death." "What does he want?" Michael asked, though they all knew the answer. "Says his daughter stole something valuable from him, and he's here to get it back, legal or not." Ben's eyes found Karen's face. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I shouldn't have told Mary about what I overheard. Word got around and somebody must have sent word south." "It's not your fault," Karen said, though her voice shook. "What did he say exactly? That you've got no right to anything that belonged to your mother since you were sold fair and square. Says he's got legal claim to any property that belonged to his late wife, and he's prepared to fight for it." Michael's hand moved instinctively to his coat where Karen knew he kept a pistol. "How many men does he have?" Started with 5, but more have been riding in all afternoon. I count at least 8 now, maybe 10. They've made camp down by Miller's Creek, and word is they're planning to come for Karen at first light." Karen sank onto the porch steps, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. All this because of a piece of paper. "Not just any piece of paper," Michael said grimly. "That deed represents more money than most of these men will see in a lifetime. Your father's probably promised them a share if they help him get it back." "But he has no legal claim," Karen protested. "The courthouse recorded it in my name." "Legal claims don't mean much when you're facing 10 armed men in the middle of nowhere," Ben said bluntly. "Abel's betting that if he can force you to sign over the rights, the courts will accept it as valid. And if I refuse—" The two men exchanged a look that told her everything she needed to know. That evening, as word spread through the valley, something remarkable began to happen. Despite the danger, despite the fear, the neighbors began arriving at Michael's cabin. First came Doc Henderson, his arm in a sling, but his medical bag in his good hand. Then the widow Patterson with her 3 grown sons. The Kowalski family from the north end of the valley. The young couple who had just built their homestead near the creek bend. By sunset, nearly 20 people had gathered in and around Michael's cabin, brought together by news of the threat facing their newest neighbor. "Now, I'm not saying we should fight," Doc Henderson said, as the group gathered in the main room, "but I am saying we shouldn't let Abel May think he can ride into our valley and terrorize folks without consequence." "The man's got 8 or 10 guns," pointed out Carl Patterson, the widow's eldest son. "We've got farmers and shopkeepers mostly." "We've got right on our side," countered Mary Morrison, who had arrived with Ben as evening fell. "That deed is legal recorded proper, and it belongs to Karen. Abel May sold his daughter and any claims he might have had. He's got no more right to that water than he does to my chickens." "Right doesn't stop bullets," Carl replied grimly. "Maybe not," Michael said quietly, and the room fell silent. "But sometimes it stops men from firing them in the first place." He looked around the room at the gathered faces. "Abel May is counting on us being too scared to stand up to him. He's betting that if he makes enough noise and burns enough property, we'll pressure Karen to give him what he wants." "And if we don't," asked Mrs. Kowalski, "then he'll try to take it by force. But that's a lot harder to do when the whole community is watching." Karen stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room turn to her. These people barely knew her, yet they were willing to risk their safety for her sake. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. "I won't ask anyone to fight for me," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "This isn't your battle." "Begging your pardon, ma'am," Doc Henderson said gently, "but it is our battle. Today, it's your water rights. Tomorrow, it could be our land claims, our homes, our families. Men like Abel May don't stop once they get a taste of easy money." "Doc's right," Ben Morrison added. "We let him run roughshod over one of us. We might as well paint targets on all our backs." As the evening wore on, the group developed a plan. It wasn't sophisticated, but it was based on the simple principle that Abel May was counting on fear and isolation to give him an advantage. By standing together, by making it clear that the entire community was watching, they hoped to convince him that the cost of getting what he wanted would be too high. "We'll be here at dawn," Doc Henderson promised as the neighbors began to disperse to their homes. "All of us. Let Abel May see that Karen's not alone in this valley." After the last neighbor had gone, Karen sat on the porch with Michael, watching the stars appear over the mountains. The night was peaceful, belying the storm that would come with morning. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Good," Michael replied. "Fear keeps you alive, but don't let it paralyze you. Tomorrow you'll need to be strong. What if he takes the deed? What if all this was for nothing?" Michael reached over and took her hand. "Then we'll figure out what comes next. But Karen, no matter what happens tomorrow, you're not the same woman who was sold at that trading post a month ago. You've found your strength, your voice, your place in this community. That's not something anyone can take away from you. How can you be so sure? Because I've watched you bloom like a flower in the desert. You've brought life to this cabin, joy to this valley, and hope to people who'd forgotten what it looked like. Your father may have given you life, but he doesn't own it. You do. As they sat in the peaceful darkness, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the ridge above. Abel May had sent a scout to check on his daughter's defenses, and what the man saw gave him information that would shape the morning's confrontation. The stage was set for a battle that would determine not just Karen's future, but the future of everyone in Bear Creek Valley. But tonight, for a few precious hours, there was peace and the promise that whatever came next, it would be faced with courage and the support of a community that had chosen to stand together. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles, as Karen prepared to face the greatest test of her life. Dawn broke over Bear Creek Valley with an ominous stillness that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Karen had barely slept, tossing restlessly in her loft, as her mind raced through all the terrible possibilities the morning might bring. When she finally gave up on sleep and climbed down to the main room, she found Michael already dressed and standing at the window, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands. "They're moving," he said quietly without turning around. "I can see their campfire smoke shifting. Won't be long now." Karen joined him at the window, her stomach churning with anxiety. In the distance, she could make out dark figures moving around the distant camp, and even from this far away, the sight of them made her skin crawl. Her father was out there, plotting to take away everything her mother had tried to preserve for her. "Michael," she began, but he held up a hand for silence. "Listen," he said. Through the morning air came the sound of horses and wagon wheels. Their neighbors were arriving as promised. Doc Henderson's buggy appeared first, followed by the Patterson boys on horseback. Then came Ben and Mary Morrison, with their wagon loaded with what looked like supplies for a long standoff. One by one, the families of Bear Creek Valley converged on Michael's cabin, their faces grim but determined. "Bless them," Karen whispered, tears pricking at her eyes. "They're really going to stand with us." "Never doubted it for a minute," Michael replied, but she could hear the relief in his voice. "These are good people, Karen. They understand what's at stake here." By the time Abel May and his hired guns crested the hill overlooking Michael's property, they found themselves facing not one isolated cabin, but what amounted to a small community gathering. Nearly 30 people had assembled in the yard and on the porch, including women and children who had come to bear witness to whatever would unfold. Abel pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of the property, his face darkening as he took in the scene before him. The 10 men riding with him were a rough collection of drifters and hired guns, the kind of men who were comfortable with violence but preferred it when the odds were heavily in their favor. The sight of an entire community standing together clearly wasn't what they had expected. "Well, well," Abel called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Looks like my little girl's been making friends. That's touching, really. But this is family business, and I'd suggest you folks head on home before things get unpleasant." Doc Henderson stepped forward, his arms still in the sling from the beating he'd received the day before. "Abel May, you're not welcome in this valley. You burned out innocent families yesterday, and you've got no business being here today." "I've got every business being here," Abel snarled, dismounting from his horse. "That girl's got something that belongs to me, and I've come to collect it." "The only thing that belongs to you," Karen said, finding her voice as she stepped onto the porch, "is the shame of selling your own daughter like livestock." Her words rang clear across the yard, and she saw several of Abel's men shift uncomfortably in their saddles. Abel's face flushed red with anger. "You ungrateful little witch! Everything you've got came from me. Your mother's belongings, her papers, everything she left behind. It all belongs to me as her lawful husband." "Not anymore," Karen replied, her confidence growing with each word. "You forfeited any claim to me or my inheritance when you took payment for my sale. I have witnesses to that transaction, Papa. lots of witnesses. That was different, Abel blustered at. I was trying to find you a home, trying to get you settled with a man who could provide for you. You were trying to get rid of a burden, Michael said, stepping up beside Karen, and you succeeded. The lady is no longer your responsibility or your property. One of Abel's hired guns, a lean man with cold eyes and a tied-down pistol, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. This is touching and all, but we didn't ride all this way to listen to family squabbles. Old man, you said there was money in this. Where is it? Abel's eyes fixed on Karen with naked greed. She's got a deed, water rights to the whole creek system, worth a fortune with the railroad coming through. Then let's take it and get out of here, the gunman said, his hand moving toward his weapon. Hold on there, stranger. The voice came from Carl Patterson, who had quietly moved to a position near the barn where he had a clear line of sight on the hired guns. Nobody's taking anything from anybody without a legal fight. Legal? Abel laughed bitterly. There's nothing legal about a daughter stealing from her father. That deed belongs to me, and I'll have it back if I have to tear this place apart board by board. The deed is legally recorded in my name, Karen said firmly. I went to the courthouse yesterday. It's official and binding. Papers can be changed, Abel said, his voice taking on a menacing tone, especially when the person who signed them realizes they made a mistake. The threat was clear, and the tension in the yard ratcheted up another notch. Karen could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, waiting to see how she would respond. Her father was offering her a choice: sign over the deed willingly or have it taken by force. I won't sign anything, Karen said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. That deed represents my mother's legacy, and I won't dishonor her memory by giving it to a man who sold his own daughter for drinking money. Abel's face contorted with rage. Your mother was a fool, hiding things from her own husband. She should have trusted me to handle our affairs properly. She knew you better than you knew yourself, Karen shot back. She knew that the minute she was gone, you'd sell everything she held dear to satisfy your own weaknesses. Enough, Abel roared, pulling a pistol from his coat. I'm done talking. Girl, you've got 30 seconds to go inside and get me that deed, or I'll take it off your dead body. The yard erupted in motion. Michael stepped protectively in front of Karen while the valley men moved to defensive positions around the property. The hired guns drew their weapons but found themselves facing not just one or two opponents, but a coordinated group of neighbors who had clearly thought through their strategy. You might want to reconsider that threat, Doc Henderson called out, his good hand resting on the rifle propped against his leg. There are a lot of us, and we all know these mountains better than you do. You start shooting, and some of you won't make it out of this valley alive. And some of you won't either, the lean gunman replied coldly. Question is, how many of these farmers and shopkeepers are you willing to see dead over one piece of paper? It was Mary Morrison who broke the standoff with words that no one expected. You know what, Abel May, you're absolutely right about one thing. This is about family. She stepped forward, ignoring the weapons pointed in her direction. See, Karen's been part of our family up here for a month now. She's cooked for our sick son at our children's bedsides and brought more joy to this valley than we've seen in years. So when you threaten her, you're threatening all of us. That's right, added Ben Morrison, moving to stand beside his wife. Karen's our neighbor, our friend, and under our protection. You want that deed, you'll have to go through all of us to get it. Other voices joined in, each neighbor stepping forward to declare their support for Karen. The Kowalski family, the young homesteaders, even the shy widow from the north end of the valley, all of them willing to risk their safety for a woman who had been a stranger just weeks before. Abel looked around at the determined faces surrounding him, and for the first time uncertainty flickered in his eyes. This wasn't the easy intimidation he had planned. These people weren't backing down, and his hired guns were starting to look nervous about the odds they were facing. This is ridiculous, Abel muttered, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. All this over one ungrateful daughter. No, Karen said, stepping out from behind Michael's protective stance. This is about right and wrong. This is about a community that values justice over greed. And this is about a daughter who finally found the strength to stand up to a father who never saw her worth. She walked down the porch steps, stopping just a few feet from where Abel stood, with his pistol still drawn. The hired guns tensed, but something in her bearing gave them pause. You want the deed so badly, Papa? Then take it. Karen reached into her coat and withdrew the folded document. But know that if you do, you'll be stealing from your own flesh and blood in front of witnesses who will never forget what they saw here today. Abel's eyes fixed hungrily on the deed, but his hand hesitated. Give it here, girl. Take it, Karen repeated, holding the paper out toward him. But answer me one question first. When you're spending the money this represents, will you be able to forget the sound of Mama's voice? Will you be able to sleep knowing you destroyed the one thing she tried to leave for the daughter she loved? For a moment, something flickered across Abel's face, a shadow of the man he might have been before grief and whiskey twisted him into something cruel. But the moment passed and greed won out over conscience. Your mother's dead, he said harshly, reaching for the deed. The living matter more than the dead. But as his fingers closed around the paper, a new voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Abel May, you're under arrest. Everyone turned to see a man on horseback at the edge of the property, wearing a badge and carrying a rifle across his saddle. Sheriff Tom Bradley had arrived from the county seat, and he was not alone. Behind him rode 4 deputies, all armed and all looking very serious about their business. Sheriff, Abel said, trying to recover his composure, this is just a family matter, no need for law involvement. Funny thing about that, Sheriff Bradley replied, dismounting from his horse. See, I got word yesterday about some fires and beatings in this valley. Then this morning I got a visit from a very concerned county clerk who said someone had been asking a lot of questions about a certain water rights deed. The sheriff's eyes found Karen in the crowd. Miss May, I presume I understand you recently recorded some property rights at the courthouse. Yes, sir, Karen replied, her voice stronger than she felt. Everything legal and proper. I'm sure it was. The clerk was very thorough in his explanation of the documents. Sheriff Bradley turned back to Abel. What he found interesting was that about an hour after Miss May left town, a gentleman arrived asking very specific questions about how to challenge water rights claims. Gentleman by the name of Silas Crenshaw. Abel's face went pale. I don't know any Silas Crenshaw. That's odd, the sheriff continued conversationally, because Mr. Crenshaw told me he was working on behalf of Abel May to investigate potentially fraudulent land claims, said he had authorization to act on your behalf in all legal matters. That's not... Of course, when we went to question Mr. Crenshaw further, we discovered he had some outstanding warrants in 3 counties. Seems he makes a living helping people reclaim valuable property through questionable means. The sheriff's voice hardened. Usually involves intimidation, forged documents, and occasionally violence. Abel was sweating now despite the cool mountain air. Sheriff, I can explain. I'm sure you can, just like you can explain the burned cabins down valley and the assault on Doc Henderson here. Sheriff Bradley gestured to his deputies. Boys, I think we need to have a long conversation with Mr. May and his associates about their activities in this valley. The hired guns looked around nervously, suddenly realizing that their easy money had turned into a potential prison sentence. Several of them began backing their horses away from the confrontation. Now hold on, the lean gunman said. We were just hired to ride up here and provide protection. Didn't know nothing about no illegal activities. Then you won't mind answering some questions, one of the deputies replied. We'll start with who hired you and what exactly you were told to do. Within minutes, the entire dynamic of the confrontation had shifted. Abel's hired guns were being questioned and disarmed, while Abel himself found himself in handcuffs as the sheriff read him charges, ranging from arson to assault to conspiracy to commit theft. "This isn't over," Abel snarled at Karen as the deputies prepared to escort him away. "That deed belongs to me by right, and I'll find a way to get it back." "No, Papa," Karen said, sadly watching as the man who had given her life was led away in chains. "It is over. It's been over since the day you decided I was worth $60 to a stranger." As the sheriff and his prisoners rode away down the mountain trail, an exhausted silence fell over the gathered crowd. The crisis had passed, but the emotional toll of the morning's events weighed heavily on everyone present. "Well," Doc Henderson said, finally breaking the silence, "that was more excitement than this old valley has seen in 20 years. "Too much excitement," Mary Morrison agreed. "I think we could all use some coffee and a chance to catch our breath." As the neighbors began to disperse, many of them stopped to speak with Karen personally. Words of support, offers of help, invitations to dinner. The simple gestures of a community welcoming one of their own. Karen found herself overwhelmed by the outpouring of genuine affection from people who barely knew her. "Thank you," she said over and over again. "Thank you for standing with me. Thank you for giving us something worth standing for," Ben Morrison replied, speaking for all of them. When the last neighbor had gone, Karen and Michael found themselves alone on the porch, both of them still processing what had just happened. The deed was safe in Karen's hands, but the victory felt bittersweet. She had defeated her father, but in doing so, she had lost any hope of ever having a real relationship with him. "How do you feel?" Michael asked gently. "Empty," Karen admitted. "I thought I'd feel triumphant or relieved or something. Instead, I just feel empty." "That's because you've got a good heart," Michael said. "You wanted him to be better than he was. You wanted him to see your worth and choose love over greed. That's not weakness, Karen. That's what makes you the woman you are." Karen leaned against the porch railing, staring out over the valley that had become her sanctuary. "What happens now with the deed, I mean? Everyone knows about it now." "Now you decide what kind of steward you want to be," Michael replied. "The railroad will come calling eventually, offering big money for water rights. Land speculators will try to buy up property around the creek. You'll have choices to make about how to balance profit with protecting the community that stood by you today. It's a big responsibility." "Yes, it is, but you won't be facing it alone." Karen turned to look at him, seeing something new in his expression. "Michael, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere along the way, watching you transform from a broken woman into the strongest person I know, I fell in love with you." His words were simple, honest, and completely unexpected. "I'm saying that if you'll have me, I'd like to stand by your side for whatever comes next." Karen's heart stopped, then began beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "You love me with everything I have," Michael confirmed. "You brought life back to this cabin, joy back to my days, and hope back to my heart. You made me remember what it feels like to have something worth protecting." Tears streamed down Karen's face, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I started falling for you the moment you called me a lady in front of that crowd." Michael stepped closer gently, wiping the tears from her cheeks. "Then let's build something beautiful together. Not just a marriage, but a life that honors what we've been given. We'll manage these water rights fairly, protect this valley, and show everyone that sometimes the best things grow from the worst circumstances." As he leaned down to kiss her, Karen thought about the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 weeks ago, she had been sold like livestock by a father who saw her as worthless. Today, she was a woman of property and influence, surrounded by a community that valued her and loved by a man who saw her true worth. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted their kiss, and they looked up to see Sheriff Bradley riding back up the trail, alone. "Figured you folks would want to know," he called out as he approached. "Abel May and his associates are going to be guests of the county for quite some time. Between the arson assault and conspiracy charges, Your father's looking at several years in prison, Miss May." Karen felt a complex mix of sadness and relief. "Will I have to testify? Probably when the time comes. But don't worry, we've got plenty of evidence and witnesses. Justice will be served." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Congratulations on your engagement, by the way. Word travels fast in small communities." After the sheriff left, Karen and Michael sat together on the porch swing, planning their future as the sun climbed higher over Bear Creek Valley. They talked about wedding dates and water rights management, about building a larger house and starting a family, about all the ordinary dreams that felt extraordinary when shared with the right person. "You know what I want to do first," Karen said, as evening shadows began to lengthen across the valley. "What's that?" "I want to write a letter to every neighbor who stood with us today, thanking them and promising that as long as I control these water rights, their access will be protected. This valley took care of me when I needed it most. Now, it's my turn to take care of the valley." Michael smiled, pulling her closer. "See, I told you that you had strength you didn't even know about yet." As the stars began to appear over the mountains, Karen thought about her mother's wisdom in hiding the deed all those years ago. Mary Catherine Sullivan had understood that real security didn't come from money or property, but from community and love and the strength to stand up for what was right. The water rights would bring challenges and opportunities, but Karen faced them now with confidence born of trials survived and love freely given. She was no longer the broken woman who had been sold at a trading post. She was Karen May, future bride of Michael Boon, protector of Bear Creek Valley's water rights, and a woman who had finally found her place in the world. The deed was safe, her father was defeated, and her future stretched ahead like the clear mountain stream that would always flow through the valley she now called home. The weeks that followed brought a peace to Bear Creek Valley that felt almost surreal after the violence and tension of Abel's raid. Karen threw herself into learning everything she could about water rights management, corresponding with lawyers in the territorial capital and studying every document related to creek usage in the region. Michael watched with pride as she transformed from a woman who had never made a significant decision in her life into someone who wielded considerable influence with wisdom and grace. Their engagement became official when Michael presented her with his grandmother's ring, a simple gold band set with a small sapphire that caught the mountain light like captured sky. The proposal itself was quiet, intimate, taking place on the porch where they had shared so many evening conversations about their hopes and dreams. "It's beautiful," Karen whispered, admiring the ring as it caught the firelight. "But are you sure about this? About marrying someone who comes with so much complication?" "I'm marrying the woman who brought music back to my life," Michael replied, taking her hands in his. "Everything else is just circumstances." The wedding was planned for the first week of October, when the aspen trees would paint the mountainsides gold and the weather would still be mild enough for an outdoor celebration. Karen had insisted on making her own dress from fabric ordered from Denver, spending her evenings by lamplight carefully stitching each seam while Michael worked on expanding the cabin to accommodate their growing life together. But even as they planned their future, the outside world began to intrude in ways they hadn't anticipated. The news of Karen's water rights had spread far beyond Bear Creek Valley, reaching the ears of businessmen and speculators who saw opportunity in the mountains. Letters began arriving almost daily, some offering to purchase the rights outright, others proposing partnerships or development schemes that promised to make Karen wealthy beyond her wildest dreams. "Listen to this one," Karen said one morning, reading from a particularly elaborate proposal. "The Rocky Mountain Development Company wants to build a resort hotel beside the creek, complete with hot springs, a railroad spur, and accommodations for 500 guests. They're offering me a 20% stake in the profits, plus $50,000 up front." Michael looked up from his breakfast with a skeptical expression. "And what happens to the families who've built their lives here, The Morrisons, the Kowalskis, all the others. They say they'll offer fair compensation for any properties they need to acquire. Karen set the letter down with a sigh. It sounds generous, but you don't trust them. Should I? Every letter promises me wealth and prosperity, but none of them seem to care about what this valley means to the people who already live here. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Through the window they could see Ben Morrison riding hard toward their cabin, his face grim with urgency. "Michael, Karen," Ben called out as he dismounted. "You need to come quick. There's been an accident at the Henderson place." They found Doc Henderson's cabin in chaos. The elderly physician had fallen from his roof while attempting to repair storm damage, and his injuries were severe enough that he couldn't treat himself. Karen immediately took charge, drawing on knowledge gained from helping her mother care for the sick. Back home, "Mary, I need you to boil water and tear up clean cloth for bandages," she directed, kneeling beside the unconscious doctor. "Ben, ride to the Kowalski place and get their wagon. We'll need to transport him carefully. Michael, help me stabilize this leg before we move him." For the next 6 hours, Karen worked tirelessly to save the man who had stood with her against her father's threats. She set his broken leg with splints made from chair legs, stitched a deep gash on his scalp, and monitored his breathing as he drifted in and out of consciousness. When Doc Henderson finally opened his eyes and whispered her name, the relief in the room was palpable. "You saved his life," Mary Morrison said as they cleaned up the makeshift medical supplies. "Where did you learn to do all that?" "My mother," Karen replied simply. "She always said that healing was just another form of love, paying attention to what people needed and providing it as best you could." Word of Karen's medical skills spread quickly through the valley, and soon she found herself being called upon to tend to everything from difficult childbirths to broken bones. She discovered that she had a natural talent for diagnosis and treatment, and more importantly, a bedside manner that seemed to bring comfort to people in their darkest hours. "You know," Doc Henderson said during one of her visits to check on his recovery, "this valley could use a proper nurse, someone trained in modern medical techniques but with the kind of natural instincts you've shown." "I've thought about that," Karen admitted. "There's a nursing school in Denver that offers correspondence courses I could study while still helping folks here in the valley." "Do it," the doctor encouraged. "I won't be practicing much longer, and these people will need someone they can count on." As Karen began her nursing studies, she also continued to grapple with the constant pressure from outside interests wanting to exploit her water rights. The letters and visits became more frequent and more aggressive, with some businessmen traveling all the way to Bear Creek Valley to make their pitches in person. The most persistent was a man named Harrison Wells, who represented a consortium of Eastern investors interested in large-scale mining operations. Wells was smooth, well-dressed, and utterly convinced that he could persuade Karen to see things his way. "Miss May," he said during his third visit to the valley, "you're sitting on a gold mine, literally. The mineral surveys show significant copper and silver deposits in the high country, but they'll need massive amounts of water for processing. Your rights could be worth millions." "And what happens to the farms and ranches that depend on that water?" Karen asked. Wells waved dismissively. "There are plenty of other places to farm, but there's only one Bear Creek Valley, and only one opportunity to develop its full potential. Think of the jobs, the prosperity, the progress you could bring to this entire region." "I've seen what progress looks like when it comes at the expense of people's homes," Karen replied firmly. "I'm not interested." But Wells wasn't easily discouraged. On his fourth visit, he brought with him a different kind of pressure: information about Karen's father and his legal situation. "Abel May's trial is scheduled for next month," Wells said casually as they sat in Karen's parlor. "Funny thing about trials, they can be expensive for everyone involved. Court costs, lawyer fees, witness expenses. I imagine it's quite a burden for a small community like this." The threat was subtle but clear. Wells had connections, resources, and the ability to make the legal proceedings as difficult and expensive as possible for everyone involved. Karen felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the lengths to which these men were willing to go to get what they wanted. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Wells?" "Not at all," Wells replied with a smile that never reached his eyes. "I'm simply pointing out that cooperation benefits everyone, while obstinacy tends to create complications." After Wells left, Karen sat alone in her parlor, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of the forces arrayed against her. The weight of responsibility seemed to grow heavier each day, not just for her own future, but for the entire community that had rallied to her defense. Michael found her there an hour later, staring out the window with tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned. Karen told him about Wells's veiled threats, about the pressure she felt from all sides, about her growing fear that she was in over her head. "What if I'm not strong enough for this?" she whispered. "What if I make the wrong choices and everyone suffers because of it?" Michael sat beside her and pulled her into his arms. "Remember what you told me about your mother's healing philosophy, about paying attention to what people need and providing it as best you can? Yes. That's exactly what you've been doing with these water rights. You've been paying attention to what this community needs: protection, stability, a voice in their own future. You've been providing that as best you can. But what if it's not enough? What if men like Wells find ways to take everything anyway? Then we'll face that when it happens. But Karen, you're not the same frightened woman who was sold at that trading post. You've found your strength, your voice, your purpose. Don't let their intimidation tactics make you forget who you've become." That evening, as if summoned by Karen's moment of doubt, an unexpected visitor arrived at their cabin. Sheriff Bradley rode up just as they were finishing supper, but this time he wasn't alone. With him was a woman in traveling clothes who looked both exhausted and determined. "Miss May," the sheriff said as they dismounted, "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Catherine Morrison, no relation to your neighbors. She's a lawyer from the territorial capital, and she's been looking into the situation with your water rights." Catherine Morrison was a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to fighting battles in courtrooms rather than on mountainsides. "Miss May," she said, extending a firm handshake, "I've been investigating the various attempts to pressure you into selling your water rights, and I think you should know that you're dealing with some very dangerous people." Over the next hour, Catherine Morrison laid out a web of corruption and intimidation that stretched from Bear Creek Valley all the way to the territorial legislature. Harrison Wells and his associates weren't just businessmen seeking profit. They were part of a systematic effort to seize control of water rights throughout the mountain territories, often through legal manipulation and outright fraud. "They've done this before," Morrison explained, spreading documents across Karen's kitchen table. "In at least 6 other locations, they've used similar tactics to pressure property owners into selling at below-market prices. Threats, legal harassment, mysterious accidents, whatever it takes to get people to cooperate." "Why are you telling me this?" Karen asked. "What's your interest in all this?" Morrison's expression softened slightly. "Because my own family lost their ranch to these same tactics 5 years ago. My father refused to sell his water rights to Wells's consortium, and suddenly he found himself facing lawsuits, tax audits, and a series of accidents that destroyed his livestock and equipment. By the time it was over, he'd lost everything." "I'm sorry," Karen said, understanding the pain behind the lawyer's professional demeanor. "Don't be sorry," Morrison replied firmly. "Be prepared, because what you have here, a legally recorded deed with community support, is exactly what we need to fight back. Your case could set a precedent that protects water rights holders throughout the territory." "What are you proposing? A coordinated legal defense?" pro bono representation for you and your community, backed by every honest lawyer and judge in the territory. We make your case a symbol of standing up to corporate bullying and government corruption." Michael leaned forward, intrigued. "What would that mean for Karen, for the Valley?" "It means a fight," Morrison admitted. "Wells and his people won't give up easily, and they have resources we can only dream of. But it also means that if we win, we establish legal protections that will benefit honest folks for generations to come." Karen looked around her kitchen, at the table where she'd shared so many meals with Michael, at the window that looked out over the valley that had become her home, at the faces of people who believed in her ability to make the right choice. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Your courage," Morrison replied, "and your willingness to stand up in court and tell your story. Let people see what's really at stake here, not just money and water rights, but the ability of communities to protect themselves from outside exploitation." Over the following weeks, Catherine Morrison proved to be as formidable as her reputation suggested. She filed injunctions to prevent any forced sales of Valley property, initiated investigations into Wells's business practices, and began building a case that would expose the entire network of corruption surrounding water rights speculation. But Wells and his associates didn't remain idle. The pressure on Karen and her neighbors intensified in ways both subtle and overt. Property tax assessments suddenly doubled. Bank loans became harder to obtain. Supplies from outside vendors began arriving late or not at all. Most troubling of all were the accidents. Carl Patterson's barn caught fire under mysterious circumstances. The Kowalski family's well was contaminated with something that made their entire herd of cattle sick. These incidents couldn't be directly traced to Wells's people, but the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. "They're trying to break our will," Ben Morrison said during one of their community meetings. "Make life so difficult that we'll pressure Karen to give them what they want. Then we need to show them that we're not so easily broken." Mary Morrison replied, her voice filled with determination that surprised everyone. "We've stood together before. We can do it again." The trial of Abel May became a focal point for the broader conflict over water rights. Wells's lawyers appeared as character witnesses for Abel, painting him as a wronged father whose daughter had stolen valuable property through deception and manipulation. They portrayed Karen as an ungrateful child who had conspired with outsiders to defraud her own family. Karen's testimony became the emotional centerpiece of the trial. Standing before a packed courtroom, she told her story with quiet dignity. The years of emotional abuse, the humiliation of being sold like livestock, the discovery of her mother's hidden deed, and the community support that had given her the strength to claim her inheritance. "My father says I stole from him," Karen said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "But how can a daughter steal what was always meant to be hers? How can claiming your mother's legacy be theft when your father has already sold you for $60 to a stranger?" The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges against Abel May. But more importantly for Karen's case, they also issued a statement affirming her legal right to the water rights deed and condemning any attempts to coerce her into surrendering her property. The verdict sent shockwaves through the territory's business community. If honest courts were willing to stand up to corporate intimidation, then the easy days of seizing property through legal manipulation might be coming to an end. Wells made one final attempt to pressure Karen, directly arriving at her cabin just 3 days before her wedding with what he called his ultimate offer. $1 million, he said without preamble, cash deposited in any bank you choose in exchange for complete water rights to Bear Creek and its tributaries. More money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. Karen didn't even hesitate. "No. Don't be foolish, Miss May. You're one woman standing against forces larger than you can imagine. Take the money and start fresh somewhere else." "This is fresh," Karen replied, gesturing toward the valley spread out below them. "This is home. This is community. This is everything my mother worked to preserve for me. No amount of money could replace what I'd be giving up. Wells's facade of civility finally cracked. You're making a mistake that will cost you everything. We'll find another way to get what we want, with or without your cooperation. Then you'll have to do it without destroying this community, Karen said firmly, because I'll fight you every step of the way. After Wells left, Karen sat on her porch and thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than 4 months ago, she had been a broken woman with no voice, no choices, and no future. Now she was days away from marrying the man she loved, surrounded by a community that valued her, and standing as a symbol of resistance against forces that would exploit the innocent for profit. The wedding preparations continued, despite the ongoing legal battles. The entire valley pitched in to help with neighbors, contributing everything from flowers to furniture to make the celebration special. Doc Henderson, still recovering from his injuries but determined to participate, volunteered to perform the ceremony despite having no official authority to do so. "Are you sure this is legal?" Karen asked during one of their planning meetings. "Legal enough," Doc replied with a grin. "I've got a mail-order preacher's license from back east, and it's never been revoked. Besides, after everything this community has been through together, I'd say we've earned the right to make our own rules about what's important." The night before the wedding, Karen sat alone in her loft for what would be the last time holding her mother's Bible and thinking about the woman whose wisdom had made everything possible. Mary Catherine Sullivan had understood that true security came not from wealth or property, but from love and community and the courage to stand up for what was right. "I hope I'm making you proud, Mama," Karen whispered into the darkness. "I hope this is what you wanted for me." As if in answer, a gentle breeze stirred the curtains at her window, carrying with it the scent of wild flowers and the promise of a beautiful day ahead. Karen smiled, feeling a peace settle over her that she hadn't experienced since childhood. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Michael Boon. Tomorrow she would begin a new chapter of her life as a married woman, a landowner, and a leader in her community. But tonight she was simply Karen May, a woman who had found her worth, her voice, and her place in the world through trials that could have destroyed a weaker spirit. The water rights would always be part of her story, but they were no longer the whole story. She had learned that real wealth came from relationships built on trust and mutual respect, that true power came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down, and that the most important inheritance her mother had left her wasn't written on any deed. It was the knowledge that love and courage could overcome even the darkest circumstances. As sleep finally claimed her, Karen dreamed of morning sunlight on mountain streams, of children playing in meadows beside clear water, and of a future where the valley would remain a sanctuary for generations to come. She had fought for that future and won the right to protect it, but more than that, she had discovered that she was strong enough to deserve it. The deed was safe, the community was protected, and tomorrow would bring the celebration of a love that had grown from the ashes of her father's cruelty into something beautiful and enduring. Karen May had been sold like livestock, but Mrs. Michael Boon would be cherished like the goddess of the high country that she had always been meant to become. The wedding day dawned with the kind of crystalline perfection that seemed to exist only in the high country during early autumn. Karen woke to find frost glittering on the cabin windows like scattered diamonds, while the aspen trees blazed gold against the deep blue sky. The air carried the crisp promise of winter, but held enough warmth to make an outdoor celebration not just possible, but magical. Mary Morrison arrived before sunrise with an army of neighbor women, transforming Karen's simple cabin into something that belonged in a fairy tale. Wildflowers gathered from every corner of the valley filled mason jars and tin cans, creating bursts of color that complemented the natural beauty of the mountain setting. The women had spent weeks preparing food for the celebration: roasted venison from Ben's hunting bred, baked in outdoor ovens, preserves, and pickles that represented months of careful preparation. "Let me see you in that dress," Mary demanded as Karen emerged from behind the quilt they had strung across one corner of the main room to serve as a dressing area. Karen had transformed her mother's wedding quilt into the most beautiful gown anyone in Bear Creek Valley had ever seen. The fabric showed intricate patterns of roses and vines that seemed to come alive in the morning light, while the cut was simple but elegant, emphasizing Karen's natural grace. She had woven wild flowers into her hair, and her mother's small gold locket rested at her throat, the only jewelry she owned besides Michael's grandmother's engagement ring. "Oh, my dear," breathed the widow Patterson, tears springing to her eyes. "You look like an angel. You look like a woman who knows her own worth," Mary Morrison corrected with a smile. "Which is even better than an angel." Outside, Michael paced nervously near the makeshift altar they had constructed from lumber and decorated with pine boughs and more wildflowers. He wore his best suit, dark wool that had seen better days but was clean and pressed, and had managed to tame his unruly hair for the occasion. Ben Morrison and the other men had set up rough benches in rows facing the altar, while children ran between the trees hanging ribbons and collecting last-minute flowers. "You sure about this?" Doc Henderson asked as he approached Michael. His medical bag exchanged for a worn Bible and his preacher's credentials tucked safely in his coat pocket. "Surer than I've ever been about anything in my life," Michael replied without hesitation. "That woman in there saved me, Doc, brought me back to life when I didn't even know I was dying." "Good answer," Doc said with satisfaction, "because she's about to become the most powerful woman in 3 counties, and she'll need a husband who sees her as a partner, not a possession." As the morning progressed, neighbors continued arriving from every corner of the valley and beyond. Word of the wedding had spread throughout the territory, drawing not just friends, but curious strangers who wanted to witness the marriage of the woman who had stood up to corporate intimidation and won. Some came in wagons, others on horseback, and a few had even made the journey on foot, carrying gifts and good wishes from communities that had heard Karen's story. Sheriff Bradley arrived with his wife and 2 daughters, bringing with him a letter from the territorial governor officially commending Karen for her courage in exposing corruption in the water rights system. Catherine Morrison rode in just before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, carrying news that Wells and his associates were facing federal investigation for their activities throughout the mountain territories. "This is what victory looks like," Morrison told Karen as they stood together watching the gathering crowd. "Not just personal victory, but the kind that changes things for everyone who comes after." "It doesn't feel like victory," Karen admitted. "It feels like coming home." "Same thing sometimes," Morrison replied with a smile. The ceremony itself was simple but profound. Doc Henderson spoke about love and partnership, about the courage required to build a life together in challenging circumstances, and about the community that surrounded and supported the couple. When it came time for vows, Michael and Karen had chosen to speak from their hearts rather than recite traditional words. "Karen," Michael said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, "6 months ago I was a man who had given up on tomorrow. You brought music back to my life, hope back to my heart, and purpose back to my days. Promise to stand beside you through whatever challenges come, to support your dreams as fiercely as you've supported mine, and to love you not just for who you are, but for who you helped me become." Karen's voice was steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Michael, you saw my worth when no one else would, offered me freedom when I expected only servitude, and gave me love when I had forgotten I deserved it. I promise to be your partner in all things, to face the future with courage, because I know I won't face it alone, and to build with you a life that honors the gifts we've been given." When Doc Henderson pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that rose from the crowd echoed off the surrounding mountains like thunder. Michael kissed his bride while their neighbors threw flower petals and shouted congratulations. and for a moment the weight of responsibility and the memory of past struggles faded into pure joy. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in the valley, while musicians who had traveled from as far away as Denver provided entertainment that had everyone dancing under the stars. Karen found herself swept from conversation to conversation, receiving congratulations and well wishes from people whose lives had been touched by her story. "You know what I admire most about you?" asked an elderly woman who had introduced herself as Mrs. Cooper from Pine Ridge. "You could have taken that $1 million and disappeared, but you stayed and fought for people you'd only known a few months." "They fought for me first," Karen replied simply. "When my own father wouldn't stand by me, these people did. How could I do any less for them?" As the evening wore on, Karen noticed Michael deep in conversation with several men near the edge of the celebration. She recognized some of them as valley residents, but others were strangers who carried themselves with the bearing of businessmen or officials. When she approached the group, the conversation quieted in a way that immediately put her on alert. "What's going on?" she asked, sliding her arm through Michael's. "Mr. Boon was just telling us about your water management plans," said one of the strangers, a well-dressed man with calculating eyes. "Very impressive, very community-minded. And you are James Whitmore, representing interests from back east, who are very interested in the development potential of this region." His smile was polite but predatory. "We were hoping to discuss some investment opportunities with you." Karen felt Michael tense beside her. These weren't celebration guests. They were more businessmen hoping to profit from her water rights, just with better manners than Harrison Wells. "Gentlemen," she said with perfect courtesy, "this is my wedding day. I'm not conducting business today." Of course," Whitmore replied smoothly. "Perhaps we could arrange a meeting next week. I think you'll find our proposals much more reasonable than what you've been dealing with lately." "Mrs. Boon's calendar is quite full," Michael interjected firmly. "If you're interested in discussing water rights, you'll need to go through proper legal channels." "Naturally," Whitmore said, but his eyes remained fixed on Karen. "Though I should mention that circumstances in the territory are changing rapidly. New territorial legislation, federal involvement in resource management, shifting political winds. It would be wise to consider your options carefully before those options become limited." The threat was delivered with a smile, but it was unmistakably a threat nonetheless. Karen felt a familiar chill run down her spine, but this time it was accompanied by something new, a fierce protectiveness for the community that had become her family. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying clearly enough that nearby conversation stopped, "I've spent the past 4 months learning that men like you mistake politeness for weakness and kindness for stupidity. Let me be clear, I will not be intimidated, bought, or manipulated into betraying the people who stood by me when I needed them most. I'm simply suggesting that you consider the broader implications of your decisions." Whitmore replied, his smile becoming strained. "I have considered them," Karen said firmly, "and my decision is that Bear Creek Valley will remain a place where families can build honest lives without fear of being displaced by outside speculators. If that creates problems for your investors, I suggest they find other places to invest." Sheriff Bradley appeared at Karen's shoulder as if materialized from thin air. "Gentlemen, I don't believe I saw you on the guest list for this celebration." "We were just leaving," Whitmore said hastily. "Congratulations on your marriage, Mrs. Boon. I'm sure we'll be speaking again soon." After the unwelcome visitors departed, the celebration resumed, but the encounter had reminded everyone present that Karen's struggles were far from over. The water rights that had brought her security and influence would continue to attract the attention of men who saw opportunity in other people's vulnerability. "You handled that well," Catherine Morrison said, appearing at Karen's side as the dancing resumed. "Professional, firm, and absolutely clear about your boundaries." I'm learning, Karen replied. Slowly, but I'm learning. Good, because there will be more of them. The territorial government is under increasing pressure from Washington to open up more land and resources for development. Your water rights represent a significant obstacle to several major projects, which means you represent a significant obstacle. What kind of projects? Railroad expansion, large-scale mining operations, agricultural development schemes that would require massive irrigation systems. Your creek feeds into the river system that supplies water to half the territory. Control that water and you control the region's future. Karen looked around at her neighbors celebrating under the star-filled sky and felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily on her shoulders. I never wanted to be a symbol or a political figure. I just wanted a home. Sometimes we don't get to choose our role in history, Morrison said gently, but you've shown that you're strong enough to handle whatever comes next. As the celebration wound down and guests began departing for their homes, Karen and Michael found themselves alone on their porch for the first time as husband and wife. The valley spread out below them, peaceful in the moonlight with scattered lights from cabin windows, creating a constellation that mirrored the stars above. Do you ever regret it? Michael asked, pulling Karen close against the evening chill. Choosing this fight instead of taking the easy money and starting fresh somewhere else. Never, Karen replied without hesitation. This valley gave me everything I needed to become who I was meant to be. How could I regret protecting that, even if it means a lifetime of fighting men like Whitmore and Wells? Especially then, someone has to stand up for the people who can't stand up for themselves. If I don't use these rights to protect this community, then I'm no better than the men trying to exploit it. Over the following months, Karen's reputation as a principled defender of water rights spread throughout the territory and beyond. Delegations came from other communities facing similar pressures, seeking her advice and support. Lawyers arrived to study her case as a model for protecting property rights against corporate intimidation. Newspaper reporters made the journey to Bear Creek Valley to interview the woman who had become a symbol of resistance against exploitation. But the attention brought new challenges. The territorial legislature, under pressure from powerful business interests, began considering laws that would allow the government to seize water rights for the greater good through eminent domain. Federal officials appeared periodically to conduct surveys and assessments that everyone understood were really attempts to find ways to challenge Karen's legal claims. Most troubling of all was the discovery that some of their own neighbors were being approached with offers to testify against Karen's character and management of the water rights. The pressure was subtle but persistent. Promises of financial assistance, threats of regulatory troubles, suggestions that cooperation would be remembered when future opportunities arose. It's divide and conquer, Catherine Morrison explained during one of her regular visits to the valley. They can't defeat you directly, so they're trying to isolate you from your support base. What can we do about it? Michael asked. Keep doing what you've been doing. Be good neighbors, fair partners, and principled leaders. Make it clear that attacking Karen means attacking the entire community's interests. The strategy worked, but it required constant vigilance. Karen found herself spending as much time on politics and public relations as she did on actual water management. She testified before territorial committees, wrote letters to newspapers defending her stewardship of the creek, and hosted visits from government officials who always seemed to be looking for reasons to question her authority. Through it all, she never lost sight of why she was fighting. The valley prospered under her careful management of the water rights. Farmers had reliable irrigation, ranchers had water for their livestock, and new families continued to arrive, drawn by the promise of fair treatment and community support. The economic benefits flowed throughout the region, proving that responsible resource management could create prosperity without exploitation. The first major test of Karen's resolve came in the spring when the territorial governor himself arrived for what was officially described as a fact-finding mission. Governor Samuel Hayes was a political appointee from back east who owed his position to the same business interests that had been pressuring Karen to sell her rights. Mrs. Boon, Hayes said during their formal meeting in the cabin, that had become an unofficial center of territorial water rights policy. I'm sure you understand the delicate balance between individual property rights and territorial development needs. I understand that individuals have rights that don't disappear just because someone else has bigger plans, Karen replied carefully. Of course, but surely you can see that your stewardship of these water rights affects far more than just your immediate community. The territory's growth depends on responsible resource allocation. I agree completely. That's why I've been working with territorial engineers to develop sustainable usage guidelines that protect both current users and future development. Hayes looked uncomfortable, as if her reasonable approach was somehow unexpected. Yes, well, that's commendable. But there are larger considerations at play: federal policies, interstate commerce issues, national security concerns. Are you saying my water rights pose a threat to national security? Karen asked with barely concealed amusement. I'm saying that in times of rapid territorial development, sometimes individual interests must give way to collective needs. Michael leaned forward in his chair. Governor, are you here to threaten my wife's legal property rights? Not at all, Hayes replied hastily. I'm simply exploring options for ensuring that territorial resources are managed in ways that benefit everyone. They are being managed that way, Karen said firmly. Every family in this valley has access to the water they need. Every ranch, every farm, every household. The creek is healthier now than it was when I inherited these rights because we've implemented conservation measures and sustainable usage practices. But what about future growth? What about the railroad? What about mining operations that could employ thousands of workers? What about them? If those projects are truly beneficial, they can be designed to work within sustainable water usage limits. If they can't, then maybe they're not as beneficial as their promoters claim. The governor's visit ended without resolution, but it marked a turning point in the territorial government's approach to Karen's water rights. Within weeks, new regulations were proposed that would have severely limited her authority to manage water usage, effectively transferring control to territorial appointed boards dominated by business interests. The fight that followed consumed the better part of a year. Karen found herself testifying before legislative committees, organizing petition drives, and coordinating with other property rights advocates throughout the territory. Catherine Morrison worked tirelessly to challenge the new regulations in court, while supporters from across the region wrote letters and held rallies defending the principle of individual property rights. The climax came during a massive public hearing in the territorial capital, where Karen was invited to defend her stewardship before a packed auditorium filled with business leaders, politicians, and ordinary citizens who had traveled from across the territory to witness the proceedings. Mrs. Boon, said the committee chairman, a man whose connections to railroad interests were well known. You've heard the testimony about the economic benefits that could flow from more flexible water rights management. How do you respond to claims that your current approach is holding back territorial development? Karen stood to address the committee, aware that every word would be reported in newspapers throughout the region. She wore a simple dress that Mary Morrison had helped her choose, elegant but not ostentatious, professional but approachable. Her mother's locket gleamed at her throat, a reminder of the legacy she was fighting to protect. Gentlemen, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, I've been called many things over the past 2 years, stubborn, short-sighted, selfish, but I've never been called unfair, dishonest, or wasteful in my management of Bear Creek's water resources. She gestured toward the packed gallery where dozens of her neighbors sat in support. These people will tell you that their farms are more productive, their ranches more profitable, and their communities more prosperous under my stewardship than they ever were before. They'll tell you that water has never been more fairly distributed or more carefully conserved. But what about larger development projects? Interrupted one committee member. What about them? Karen replied calmly. I've never opposed responsible development. I've opposed exploitation. I've opposed projects that would devastate existing communities for the benefit of outside speculators. I've opposed schemes that would turn our mountains into industrial wastelands and our streams into open sewers. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. I was sold like livestock by my own father to men who saw me as nothing more than property to be exploited. I know what it feels like to be treated as less than human by people who measure worth only in dollars. I will not allow that to happen to the communities I'm privileged to serve. The applause that followed her words was thunderous, drowning out the committee chairman's attempts to restore order. When it finally died down, Karen continued with quiet intensity. You want to know about my vision for territorial development? It's communities where families can build honest lives without fear of displacement. It's prosperity that lifts everyone up instead of concentrating wealth in the hands of a few. It's progress that preserves the natural beauty and resources that make this territory worth living in. She looked directly at the committee chairman. If that vision conflicts with your plans for development, then perhaps you need better plans. The hearing ended with no immediate decision, but the tide of public opinion had clearly shifted in Karen's favor. Newspapers throughout the territory editorialized in support of her position, while politicians began distancing themselves from the most aggressive attempts to seize her water rights. The final victory came 6 months later when the Territorial Supreme Court ruled definitively that Karen's water rights were constitutionally protected private property that could not be seized without due process and just compensation. More importantly, the court established precedents that would protect similar rights holders throughout the territory for generations to come. On the second anniversary of her wedding, Karen stood on her porch, watching the sun set over Bear Creek Valley, reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. The valley was more prosperous than ever, with new families continuing to arrive, drawn by the promise of fair treatment and community support. Her nursing practice had grown to serve 3 counties, while her reputation as a water rights advocate had made her one of the most influential women in the territory. Any regrets? Michael asked, joining her on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. Only one, Karen replied, accepting the warm cup gratefully. What's that? I wish my mother could have seen all this. Wish she could have known that her sacrifice wasn't in vain. Michael slipped his arm around her waist. She knew. That's why she hid the deed in the first place. She knew you'd have the strength to use it wisely when the time came. As they stood together watching the stars appear over the mountains, Karen thought about the girl who had been sold at a trading post 3 years ago, broken, hopeless, convinced she was worthless. That girl could never have imagined becoming the woman she was, now wife, community leader, defender of the powerless, and guardian of one of the territory's most valuable resources. The transformation hadn't been easy. It had required courage she didn't know she possessed, strength she had to discover within herself, and support from a community that had chosen to see her worth when she couldn't see it herself. But every challenge had made her stronger. Every victory had increased her confidence, and every day brought new opportunities to use her influence for the benefit of others. Mrs. Boon, Michael said formally, I believe you've become exactly what that mountain man saw in you from the very beginning. What's that? A goddess of the high country. Karen laughed, the sound echoing across the peaceful valley like music. Just a woman who learned to fight for what matters, she corrected, and lucky enough to have found something worth fighting for. The water rights that had caused so much conflict were now a tool for building rather than destroying, protecting rather than exploiting, lifting up rather than tearing down. The valley prospered, the community thrived, and the streams ran clean and clear toward a future that promised hope rather than fear. From worthless merchandise to the most powerful woman in 3 counties, from a father's disgrace to a community's treasure, from a broken spirit to an unbreakable will, Karen's transformation was complete. She had become not just the goddess of the high country, but the guardian of everything that made the mountains worth protecting. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow blessing this small valley where justice had triumphed, love had conquered, and one woman's courage had changed the world for everyone who would come after. 10 years had passed since Karen first arrived in Bear Creek Valley, as broken merchandise sold by her own father, and the woman who now stood addressing the territorial legislature bore little resemblance to that frightened girl. At 33, Karen Boon commanded respect from politicians, business leaders, and ordinary citizens throughout the mountain territories. Her testimony on water conservation had influenced territorial policy. Her nursing expertise had saved countless lives, and her principled leadership had transformed Bear Creek Valley into a model community that drew visitors from across the nation. But success had brought new challenges that tested her resolve in ways she had never anticipated. The railroad had finally arrived in the region, bringing with it a flood of newcomers who saw the mountains not as home, but as opportunity. Mining claims multiplied like wildflowers after rain, each one requiring water that had to come from somewhere. The territorial government, under pressure from Washington to increase mineral production for the growing nation's needs, had grown increasingly aggressive in its attempts to override local water management. Boon, said Territorial Representative Charles Morrison during the current legislative session, surely you can see that your continued resistance to reasonable development is becoming a hindrance to territorial progress. Karen stood at the witness table wearing a tailored blue dress that Mary Morrison had helped her choose for maximum professional impact. Her hair was styled in the latest fashion, and her bearing conveyed confidence earned through years of fighting these same battles. Representative Morrison, she replied calmly, I see that defining reasonable development continues to be the heart of our disagreement. Stripping away environmental protections and community safeguards in the name of progress isn't reasonable. It's reckless. But the economic benefits to the territory could be enormous, pressed another representative. We're talking about thousands of jobs, millions in tax revenue connections to national markets that could transform this entire region. At what cost? Karen asked, opening the leather portfolio she had brought with her. I have reports here from mining regions back east, where similar reasonable development has left communities devastated, waterways poisoned, and local economies dependent on boom and bust cycles that ultimately benefit no one but distant investors. She distributed copies of photographs and documents to the committee members. This is what unregulated mining did to the coal regions of Pennsylvania. This is what happened to farming communities in Montana when outside interests gained control of water rights. This is what we're trying to avoid here. The committee chairman, a portly man whose railroad connections were well known, frowned as he examined the materials. These are isolated examples, Mrs. Boon. Modern mining techniques, proper oversight. Proper oversight from whom? Karen interrupted politely. The same territorial government that's been pressuring me to surrender local control of water management. The same officials who've been meeting privately with mining company representatives while excluding community voices from the planning process. The accusation hit home because it was true. Catherine Morrison had documented numerous instances of closed-door meetings between territorial officials and business interest sessions, where policy was shaped without input from the communities that would be affected by the decisions. Mrs. Boon, said Representative James Hartwell, a younger man who had shown more willingness to listen to environmental concerns, what would you propose as an alternative? Surely you're not suggesting that we reject all development in favor of maintaining the status quo. Karen smiled, recognizing a genuine question when she heard one. Not at all, Representative Hartwell. I'm suggesting that we develop comprehensive planning that balances economic opportunity with environmental protection and community welfare. Other territories have done it successfully. She pulled out another set of documents. Colorado has implemented mining regulations that require companies to post bonds for environmental cleanup, establish local hiring preferences, and contribute to community development funds. California has water management laws that protect existing users while allowing for reasonable new development. We could adapt similar approaches here. But that would increase costs for developers, objected the chairman. It would increase upfront costs while reducing long-term costs to communities and taxpayers, Karen corrected. When mining companies are required to clean up after themselves, they design more efficient operations. When they have to hire locally, they invest in worker training and community infrastructure. When they contribute to development funds, they become partners in regional growth rather than extractors of regional wealth. The debate continued for several hours with Karen fielding questions that ranged from genuinely curious to openly hostile. She had learned over the years to remain calm under pressure, to support every argument with documented evidence, and to never lose sight of the human cost of the policies being discussed. When the session finally ended, Catherine Morrison approached Karen in the corridor outside the hearing room. The lawyer had grown gray at the temples over the past decade, but her eyes still burned with the passion for justice that had brought her to Bear Creek Valley years earlier. "You did well in there," Morrison said, "but I'm concerned about some intelligence I've been gathering about the federal level." "And what kind of intelligence?" "There's talk in Washington about new legislation that would give the federal government broader authority to override territorial water management in the name of national resource development. It's being pushed by some very powerful interests." Karen felt a familiar chill run down her spine. How powerful? Railroad barons, mining conglomerates, agricultural syndicates. The kind of people who see the entire West as their personal resource extraction zone. They're arguing that territorial and local control of water rights is inefficient and anti-competitive. In other words, they're tired of dealing with people like me. Exactly. They want to federalize resource management so they only have to buy off politicians in Washington instead of fighting community battles in every territory. Karen leaned against the corridor wall, suddenly feeling the weight of 10 years of constant struggle. "Catherine, sometimes I wonder if we're just delaying the inevitable. These people have more money, more influence, more patience than we do. Maybe we're just postponing a defeat that's going to come eventually anyway." "Maybe," Morrison admitted, "but maybe we're also building something that will outlast us. Look at what you've accomplished in Bear Creek Valley. Look at the model you've created for sustainable development. Look at the legal precedents we've established. Even if we lose some battles, we're changing how people think about these issues." "Is that enough?" "It's everything. Karen, when you walked onto that platform at the trading post 10 years ago, you were powerless. Today you just spent 3 hours teaching territorial representatives about environmental law and community planning. You've gone from being merchandise to being a teacher. That transformation doesn't just change you, it changes everyone who witnesses it." That evening, Karen returned to Bear Creek Valley to find the community gathered for their monthly town meeting. What had started as informal neighborhood discussions had evolved into sophisticated civic planning sessions that addressed everything from school curricula to infrastructure development to environmental protection. The territorial legislature is definitely moving toward more aggressive development policies, Karen reported to the assembled crowd. "We need to be prepared for increased pressure on our water rights and mining claims throughout the valley." Ben Morrison, now in his 60s but still sharp as ever, raised his hand. "What are our options if the territorial government tries to override your authority?" "Legal challenges, political pressure, and public education," Karen replied. "We've built strong legal protections over the years, but law is only as strong as the political will to enforce it." Mary Morrison stood up from her seat in the front row. Then we need to make sure the political will stays strong. That means getting more people like us elected to territorial offices. Mary's right, agreed Doc Henderson, his hair now completely white but his mind still keen. We can't just defend what we have. We need to expand our influence. Carl Patterson, now the Valley's unofficial coordinator for political action, pulled out a list he had been working on. I've been tracking territorial elections, and there are at least 6 seats coming up where candidates with our views could have a real chance if we organize properly. That would require significant resources, Karen pointed out. Campaign funds, volunteer coordination, media outreach. It's a big step up from local organizing. We've got resources, said Mrs. Kowalski, now the Valley's most successful rancher, after years of careful water management. More importantly, we've got credibility. People throughout the territory know that our approach works. Young Tom Henderson, Doc's nephew, who had moved to the Valley 3 years earlier with his wife and 2 children, spoke up from the back of the room. We've got something else too. We've got the next generation. My kids are growing up thinking that community cooperation and environmental protection are normal. That's going to matter when they're adults. Karen looked around the room at faces that had become as familiar as family over the past decade. These people had stood with her when she was weak, fought beside her when she found her strength, and continued to support her as she grew into leadership. The bonds forged in those early struggles had created something unprecedented in her experience, a true community where individual success was inseparable from collective welfare. All right, she said finally. If we're going to expand our political influence, we need to do it right. Professional organization, clear messaging, and candidates who understand that they're representing not just Bear Creek Valley, but a vision of what territorial development could look like. The meeting continued past midnight as they laid plans for a political campaign that would either establish their model as a viable alternative to exploitative development or mark the beginning of their defeat by forces too powerful to resist. Over the following months, Karen found herself traveling throughout the territory more than ever before, speaking at rallies, meeting with potential candidates, and building coalitions with other communities facing similar pressures. The work was exhausting but exhilarating as she discovered that Bear Creek Valley's success had inspired similar efforts across the region. In Pine Ridge, a community of small farmers had organized to protect their irrigation rights from a proposed railroad development. In Silver Creek, ranchers had formed a cooperative to resist pressure from a mining conglomerate. In Meadowbrook, townspeople had elected a mayor committed to sustainable growth policies. The movement that had begun with one woman's refusal to surrender her mother's legacy was spreading like ripples across the territorial landscape. But success brought scrutiny from opponents who had initially dismissed the Valley's efforts as an isolated anomaly. Harrison Wells, the businessman who had failed to intimidate Karen years earlier, resurfaced as a lobbyist for federal legislation that would override territorial water management. His arguments to Congress emphasized the need for rational resource allocation free from local obstructionism. Mrs. Boon represents everything that's wrong with current territorial policy. Wells testified before a congressional committee considering the new federal legislation. Individual property owners with no understanding of larger economic needs are holding hostage resources that could benefit the entire nation. When Karen was invited to provide counter-testimony, she faced a committee dominated by representatives from eastern states who had little understanding of Western conditions and significant ties to the business interests pushing for federal control. Congressman, she began, standing before the imposing chamber where national policy was made. I come before you not as an obstructionist, but as someone who has spent 10 years proving that local resource management can serve both community needs and national interests. She had prepared meticulously for this moment, bringing documentation of every aspect of Bear Creek Valley's success. economic data showing increased agricultural productivity, environmental reports demonstrating improved water quality, social statistics indicating reduced poverty and increased education levels, infrastructure development that had been funded through cooperative planning rather than outside investment. The model we've developed doesn't reject progress, she continued. It rejects exploitation. It doesn't oppose development. It insists that development serve community welfare rather than replace it. Representative William Ashford from New York, whose railroad investments were well known, leaned forward with a skeptical expression. "Mrs. Boon, your community numbers what, perhaps 300 people. How can you claim that management techniques suitable for such a small population could work on a national scale?" With respect, Congressman, I'm not claiming that our specific techniques would work everywhere. I'm claiming that our principles would work everywhere. Community involvement in planning environmental protection, fair distribution of benefits, local hiring preferences, and long-term thinking instead of quarterly profit maximization. But surely you understand that efficiency requires centralized management, pressed Representative Charles Morton from Massachusetts. Local communities lack the expertise and resources to make optimal decisions about resource allocation. Karen smiled, remembering similar arguments from territorial officials years earlier. Congressman, in the past 10 years, our inexpert local management has increased agricultural productivity by 40%, reduced water waste by 60%, and created a sustainable economic base that isn't dependent on boom and bust resource extraction. Meanwhile, regions under expert outside management have seen environmental degradation, community displacement, and economic instability. Those are isolated examples, Morton replied dismissively. With respect, sir, so is every success, until it becomes a model worth replicating. The congressional hearing made national headlines, with newspapers throughout the country picking up the story of the Western woman who had challenged federal resource policy. Some coverage was sympathetic, portraying Karen as a David facing corporate Goliaths. Other articles dismissed her as a naive idealist, standing in the way of national progress. The attention brought both opportunities and dangers. Speaking invitations poured in from reform groups throughout the country, while death threats arrived from anonymous sources, warning her to stop interfering with natural economic development. Federal investigators appeared in Bear Creek Valley, ostensibly conducting routine surveys, but clearly looking for evidence of mismanagement or corruption they could use to discredit Karen's leadership. Most troubling was the discovery that some Valley residents were being offered substantial payments to relocate, with the obvious intent of weakening community support for Karen's policies. The offers were always presented as legitimate business opportunities. Jobs in distant mines, land purchases at inflated prices, investment opportunities that required leaving the valley. "They're trying to buy out our base of support," Michael observed during one of their evening strategy sessions. "Can't defeat us directly, so they're trying to hollow us out from within." "It's working too," Karen admitted with frustration. "The Jensen family took that mining job in Colorado last month. The Williams sold their ranch to that development company from Chicago. Every family that leaves makes us a little more vulnerable." "But new families keep arriving," Catherine Morrison pointed out. "People who've heard about what you're building here and want to be part of it." "True, but the new arrivals don't have the same history, the same emotional investment in fighting these battles. They came here for the prosperity, not for the struggle that created it." "Then we need to make sure they understand that the prosperity depends on continuing the struggle," Morrison said firmly. "Community education, civic engagement, helping newcomers understand what's at stake." The challenge of integrating new residents while maintaining community cohesion became a central focus of Valley planning. Karen instituted orientation programs for new families, pairing them with established residents who could explain the history and principles that guided local decisions. Town meetings expanded to include educational components about water management, environmental protection, and cooperative economics. The most significant test of these efforts came when a major mining company proposed to establish operations just outside the valley boundaries, claiming they could provide jobs and tax revenue without directly affecting valley water rights. The proposal split the community in ways that earlier challenges had not, with newer residents seeing economic opportunity while older families recognized the threat to everything they had built. "Mrs. Boon," said David Richardson, a recent arrival who had moved his family from St. Louis seeking a better life, "I understand your concerns about environmental protection, but my children need opportunities. If this mine could provide good-paying jobs for local workers, shouldn't we at least consider it?" The question was asked during a packed town meeting where the mining proposal dominated discussion. Karen could see the room divided between longtime residents who remembered the struggles of the past decade and newer arrivals who saw only potential benefits. "Mr. Richardson," she replied carefully, "your children do need opportunities, but they also need a community that will still exist when they're adults. They need clean water, healthy soil, and an economic base that doesn't disappear when the ore runs out." But what if the company meets all environmental standards? What if they guarantee local hiring and contribute to community development? Then we evaluate their proposal against our principles and make a decision based on evidence rather than promises, Karen said. But we do it with full knowledge of what we've built here and what we stand to lose if we make the wrong choice. The debate continued for weeks, with Karen finding herself in the unfamiliar position of having to convince people in her own community to support policies they had all agreed on when the stakes were theoretical. It was one thing to stand together against outside threats. It was another to maintain unity when presented with opportunities that promised individual benefit. The turning point came when representatives from the mining company arrived to make their formal presentation. They were smooth, professional, and utterly convincing in their promises of environmental responsibility and community partnership. But Karen recognized the type immediately, polished versions of the men who had tried to intimidate her years earlier. "We understand your concerns about environmental protection," the lead representative assured the assembled community. "Our company has the most advanced extraction techniques available with minimal impact on local water supplies." "Define minimal," Karen asked. "Well, there would be some increased usage during peak operations, but nothing that would significantly affect residential or agricultural needs." "How much is some?" The representative consulted his notes. "Approximately 12 million gallons per month during active mining phases." A gasp ran through the crowd. 12 million gallons represented nearly half of the creek's total flow during dry seasons. "And peak operations would last how long?" Karen pressed. "The initial phase would be 18 to 24 months, depending on ore quality and market conditions." "What about cleanup and restoration after mining operations conclude?" "The site would be restored to appropriate environmental standards, as determined by territorial and federal regulations." Karen had learned to read between the lines of such presentations. Appropriate standards usually meant minimal compliance with regulations that were written by the same interests that operated the mines. Restored typically meant left in a condition that met legal requirements but bore no resemblance to the original landscape. "What guarantees would the community have that these promises would be kept?" asked Ben Morrison. "Our company's reputation speaks for itself," the representative replied smoothly. "We've operated successfully throughout the Western Territories with full community support." Catherine Morrison stood up from her seat in the back of the room. "I've researched your company's operations in other territories. Would you like me to share what I found?" The representative's confident expression flickered. "Ms. Morrison, I'm sure you'll find that any concerns about past operations have been greatly exaggerated by opponents of responsible development." "Really?" "Because I have documented evidence of groundwater contamination in 3 locations, community displacement in 2 others, and ongoing legal battles over cleanup responsibilities in at least 5 sites. Those are isolated incidents taken out of context. They're a pattern of behavior that predicts exactly what would happen here if we allowed your company to begin operations. The meeting ended with the community voting overwhelmingly to reject the mining proposal, but the debate had revealed underlying tensions that would need to be addressed if the valley's unity was to be maintained. Karen realized that success had brought a new challenge: the need to constantly re-educate and re-energize a community as its membership evolved. That night, as she and Michael sat on their porch, looking out over the valley that had become the center of their world, Karen reflected on how much had changed since her father sold her like livestock at a trading post. She had gained power, influence, and respect beyond anything she could have imagined, but she had also inherited responsibilities that sometimes felt overwhelming. "Do you think we're fighting a losing battle?" she asked Michael. "All these years of struggle and we're still having to defend the same principles against the same types of people." "Maybe that's the point," Michael replied thoughtfully. "Maybe the struggle is what keeps the principles alive. Maybe the moment we stop fighting is the moment we lose what we've built." "But I'm tired, Michael. I'm tired of always being on guard, always having to prove that our way works, always having to choose between individual opportunity and community welfare." Michael took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years of their marriage. "You know what I see when I look out over this valley. I see children playing beside clean streams. I see families who've built prosperity without destroying the land that sustains them. I see a community that values cooperation over competition, sustainability over short-term profit, and justice over expedience. And that's enough. Karen, when your father sold you for $60, did you imagine that you'd spend your life creating something this beautiful? Did you dream that you'd become a voice for people who couldn't speak for themselves? Did you envision yourself standing before Congress, defending principles that could transform how this entire nation thinks about development? Karen smiled despite her exhaustion. "No, I dreamed of survival, maybe a little peace and dignity." "You got survival, peace, and dignity, but you also got the chance to give those things to others. That's not nothing, Karen, that's everything." As they sat together under the star-filled sky, Karen thought about the girl who had stood on that trading post platform, convinced she was worthless merchandise. That girl couldn't have imagined becoming the woman who now bore responsibility for water rights that affected thousands of people, whose testimony influenced territorial policy, whose example inspired communities throughout the West. The transformation hadn't ended the struggle. It had simply changed the nature of the battle. But every victory, no matter how small, created space for other victories. Every stand taken made it easier for others to stand. Every principle defended strengthened the foundation for future progress. Karen Boon had become far more than the goddess of the high country that Michael had called her on their wedding day. She had become a symbol of what was possible when ordinary people refused to accept that exploitation was inevitable, when communities chose cooperation over surrender, when individuals discovered that their greatest strength lay not in what they could take, but in what they could protect. The water still flowed clear and clean through Bear Creek Valley, carrying with it the promise that some things were worth defending, some principles were worth fighting for, and some transformations could change, not just individual lives, but the entire world around them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new opportunities to prove that another way was possible. But tonight, Karen was content to sit beside the man who had seen her worth when no one else would, looking out over the valley that had become her sacred trust, knowing that she had used her freedom well. The girl sold for $60 had become a woman whose influence was beyond price, and her story was still being written in the clear mountain streams and prosperous families and principled stands that would outlast them all.